Okay, well, if people can hear me okay, I could see a thumbs up, and I very much appreciate some of the remarks that Richard and Mike Sraga and, of course, Todd have made. I was amused to hear Richard talk about the element of chance at NARL because I at one time thought of doing a talk or an essay on the inevitability of NARL, going back to the first International Polar Year and some of the unsung heroes of the 1880s era. But that's for another time, another discussion. I told the organizers that I would talk about lessons from the middle years of NARL history, and that middle years would be from 1972, the 25th anniversary of NARL, to 1997, the 50th anniversary of NARL. But I violated the title so badly, I was tempted to say, oh, revise my title. And I never did, because I just never got around to saying I was wrong to limit myself. Todd's picture of proto-NARL in the late 40s, I think he said he figured it was 1946, is a good start for this talk, because this picture was taken, as it says, on the 24th of July of 1977. That was about 5 years into the middle third of the history of NARL, UIC NARL, and it was taken by Tom Albert. And I can just picture him looking at the airfield where his airplane was about to turn and land, and seeing, my gosh, this is a spectacular view. It's clear all the way to the point. And he snapped this picture and made a gift of it to a number of people. And I really enjoy the picture. One of the things that, well, there are several things that are important about this July 1977 era. It was the time at which Tom Albert was returning to Barrow for the second major part of his 22 years spent in Barrow or Utqiagvik, a distinguished career of continuing investigations into bowhead whales, and really essentially being the founding director of the North Slope Borough Department of Wildlife Management, for whom Todd Svormore works. Another person who was just at the beginning of an important phase of his career was John Kelly. John J. Kelly was starting in 1977 as the last scientific director of NARL while it was under naval support. And John Kelly deserves an awful lot of credit that I don't think we've fully appreciated, because it was a very important transitional period for NARL, for the North Slope Borough, for Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, Utqiagvik Inupiaq Corporation. And John Kelly really put his whole soul into making those transitions work. Long after he spent 2.5 years or 3 years as the final director of NARL from the university, he continued to help the political stability, the political growth of these organizations in the latter years of the UIC NARL. Now, speaking to the theme that I thought I was going to be able to speak to, this was a timeline that we developed to talk about to rationalize, let's say, the various forces on the development of the first 50 years of NARL. There were lab shaping events, name changes, directorships, episodes of big science, such as the International Geophysical Year, tundra biome that we'll talk about briefly. Then there were federal legislative actions, from the National Environmental Policy Act through Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and there were community events that all shaped the laboratory and its history. If I were to obey my original intent, I would talk only about the period between 1972 and 1997, the two 25th and 50th anniversaries. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't make that work. I couldn't confine myself because the importance of the lab really extends over time to a degree that I had not fully understood until I got into working with trying to make sense of the 50th anniversary celebration. Here's a picture that I think I don't know who took it. I think it probably was Jerry Brown of some of the or it was his camera, because his picture is if I don't know if my cursor shows up, but there's Jerry Brown in 1997, along with other people, Max Brewer. There's Richard Glenn, by golly, in 1997, John Schindler, John Kelly, whom we've just talked about briefly, Tom Albert, I've just mentioned, Kenneth Tuvok, who deserves lots of mentions. And somehow I had missed the 25th anniversary of NARL. I was too junior, I think, or still too involved with finishing my graduate degree. So I didn't figure in, but perversity took over in 1997, and somehow I got drafted to be the editor of the proceedings of the 50th anniversary commemoration of NARL. And most importantly, for that book to have importance, John Kelly, the final director, as I mentioned, he anticipated a need for humanizing the eventual written celebration of the 50th anniversary by soliciting letters from lots and lots of people who were as affectionate toward the experience of NARL as possible. And it really did make a great deal of difference to a book that was about 2/3 devoted to scientific retrospective and 1/3 devoted to this humanizing experience of NARL. Now, looking back on what I was unable to do of just dredging experiences up from the middle 25-year history of NARL, I think now what really happened was I took a look at the history of NARL and figured, oh, I'm more like the odometer on this dashboard dial. I look at where we've been and figure out how many miles or how many kilometers we've traveled, rather than looking at the hand, the big red hand there that tells how fast we're going or how fast we should be going in a certain speed zone. The present day academic meritocracy is pretty fast. This is nanosecond technology. The idea in science in particular is to publish early, publish quickly, publish often, publish with as many co-authors as you possibly can, and do this over and over again. It puts a premium on the least or the smallest publishable unit, and it's very hectic paced. So I'm tempted to reflect on where I got stuck with the remarks I'm about to make, and conclude that the old saying attributed to George Bernard Shaw that youth is wasted on the young, there should be an antidote to that. Retirement is wasted on the elderly might be a way of balancing the outlook on demographics of scientists and other analysts. So I'm going to look at a couple of examples of how long it takes. This is a sort of an essay on the passage of time in relation to NARL history. How long it takes to make sense of something. In those middle years, but it started before the end of the 25th anniversary of NARL, one of the big undertakings was this study of Arctic ecosystems, particularly the tundra biome, which was part of the International Biological Program, which Jerry Brown can correct me, but I think it extended from about 1968 to 1974. One of the chief outputs of the exemplary work done at Gnarl on coastal tundra at Barrow was this volume that Jerry Brown and 3 other editors put together, talking about an Arctic ecosystem. It was brilliantly written, it was synthetic, it was readable, it's still fun to go through it today. And as Jerry Brown pointed out to me, it was one of several volumes put out by the tundra biome part of the International Biological Program. Another example of how long it takes to understand all that we know was kind of a surprise. In 1997, during the 75th anniversary, 2 people showed up to participate. One of them was Leonard Leshak, whom I had known in 1977 very slightly as a would-be contractor working on, he wanted to use a 1 or 2 person submersible, a little manned submarine, to help us investigate offshore ecosystems under the sea ice. And we just didn't have the amount of money, or we didn't know in advance of oil and gas exploration where exactly this supposed, we called it a yellow submarine, should spend effort. We didn't have the money. So we sent Leonard Leshak away in 1977. He showed up in 1997 with co-author Bill Leary, having produced a book about a spy story in which Leonard Leshak was one of 2 parachutists who dropped in on an abandoned Soviet ice station, which was really a part of the Cold War, spying on U.S. under ice submarine movements. And the point of Len Leshak's project was, how good were the Soviet instruments? How good were their living conditions? And it's important to note that this was in the days before long-range helicopters could pick up a parachutist after being parachuted on an abandoned ice station. So what the strategy was to use a long-distance modified World War II bomber. This is a B-17 with a cable catcher on the front called a Fulton Skyhook. And after many days of really tense attempts to make this work, this is an artist's rendition of how the 2 parachutists, one of whom was Len Leshak, be picked up by this cable catcher, or balloon and cable catcher, the Skyhook, and returned the 2 spies to Gnarl to be debriefed, as they were in the Building 250 library at the end of their mission in early June of 1962. Gripping story. It's still worth reading and enjoying the skullduggery. More scientifically, the length of time it takes to understand all that we know is exemplified by this book by Peter Coates, The Trans-Alaska Pipeline Controversy, subtitled Technology, Conservation, and the Frontier. Gnarl was very involved in trying to figure out what the environmental costs and benefits and penalties of transporting eventually found commercial amounts of petroleum to market. And Gnarl was in a perfect location to study the northernmost aspects of the controversies about how this should be done. And the 1969 date is that of the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act. And it took 23 years for Peter Coates' book to appear as an analysis of all the controversies and solutions that went into this. A great deal of interdisciplinary synthesis. Even more famous here in Alaska is the book by Dan O'Neill, published in 1994. This was the unraveling of the scheme that Edward Teller developed in the years 1956, especially 1957, to use thermonuclear explosions underground to develop or to showcase the ability of the Atomic Energy Commission to blast an atomic harbor or a canal system, but they had to do it on U.S. soil. So the place they chose was near Cape Thompson, south of Point Hope or Tikiak. So that took even longer to produce because it was more controversial, perhaps, and it's well known, and its connection to Narl should be noted. After 1997 and the work had begun on the commemoration of the 50th anniversary, this gentleman, Kenneth Tuvok Sr., helped us with a project, an NSF-funded project that several people were involved in, notably Craig George and I and Kenneth, at looking at hazardous ice conditions or dangerous ice events in the history of people's encounters over the years. And Kenneth is shown here trying to, or doing his best to enlighten scientists with the NSF project on how ice moves and how it can get into being a very dangerous, risky situation. It always impresses me when I look back on his help in situations like this, how he could, along with other observers, figure out how ice moved when it's very difficult in Barrow to get high off the ground, or it was in the good old days, and look down on ice the way you can today with a satellite or with drones, for example. And yet they worked out, I don't know how they did it exactly, but their observations were very spot on about the way ice pans spin in moving east and west past Utqiagvik. When her contribution has already been mentioned, Karen Brewster did a sort of biographical interview session or series with Harry Brower Sr., Kupak, and very interesting in terms of how important he was in enlightening non-whalers to what the whaling experience was all about and what could be learned from ice movements and one thing and another. One thing we were working on was a serious accident, which was called a disaster, the Evu story, from what was eventually worked out and determined to have taken place in 1957. Harry Brower himself lost his gear in 1957, and he then moved to work at the laboratory for the next 15 years, and he couldn't recover enough funding and support to re-enter the business of being an umialik, or a whaling captain, until 1972. Looking at Karen's analysis and figuring out how things happened with Kupak, I came across an interesting conclusion, and that was that he went whaling first at the age of 15 in 1939. His whaling career was interrupted because he left for service in World War II, came back and resumed whaling in 1946, then lost his gear 11 years later in 57, and as I say, did not resume whaling until 1972, and then he had to retire for health reasons in 1980. What's interesting is that for being such a well-known, well-respected coach of scientists trying to understand sea ice, he only whaled for less than 50% of the years between 50 and when he died in 1992 at the age of 68. So he whaled for a total of 25 seasons, but he spent a lot of that not whaling, but considering the experience that he'd had as a whaler. And possibly he's an excellent illustration of how his forced retirement was not wasted on the elderly or the retired, the normally retired, but he was able to synthesize a lot of his own understanding because of his interruptions of career. I was privileged to have Larry Irving, shown here on the far left, as a committee member on my graduate committee from 1970 to 73, the first director of NARL. And this happens to be a picture taken at the occasion of celebrating the new building, Building 360, in 1969. And on the far right is Max Brewer, the longest serving scientific director of NARL. Here's a picture of three of the last four directors, rather, including John Schindler and John Kelly and Max Brewer, again on the right, and Dr. Kenneth Tuvak. This was in 2003, right after he had been awarded his honorary doctorate at UAF. A favorite picture of mine. I discovered just this spring something in an archive that I had either never known about or I had totally lost memory of. I first started investigations on the tundra at Barrow in 1968, and it began in a very unfortunate way, an accident really. I was all planning to work on lemming predators in 1968. And the word was that lemmings went through these 3 to 4 year cycles of abundance and scarcity. And so I had planned to be there for a period of abundance starting in 1968, and something went wrong. We don't know for sure what it was. I got there on a shoestring to Utqiagvik, went to NARL, and there were no lemmings. There was a very low population numbers when they were supposed to be high. Fortunately, Dr. Frank Patelka and his crew, who had been studying lemmings for years, were now studying shorebirds. And they came to my rescue. They said, Norton, why don't you come join our group and you can study a different kind of bird, not the bird predators on lemmings. And so I was swept into a fortunate crew of welcoming people. The next year, that is 1969, Patelka brought the Alaska wildlife artist Bill Berry to Barrow to try and illustrate all the things that shorebirds were doing. One night after supper, Bill Berry and I got to talking, and he asked me, "How did you get involved with this shorebird group, Dave?" And I told him the story about the lemmings failing to become abundant in 1968. And he thought that was wonderful. And without my knowledge or without my remembering, he couldn't resist coming up with a poem about the lemmings and a drawing to go with it. The poem, if you can't see the full caption, is, "There'll be no mass march over the tundra, no suicide plunge in the chill. Not a lemming in sight, for they've all seen the light, and this year they're taking the pill." That was July 1969, and it came to light because I discovered an archive that had been saved by John Kelly this spring. And so I say that this story took 53 years to mature. One of the extreme stories of how long it takes to understand all that we know is this exhibit at the University of Alaska Museum of the North, which opened last June in 2021. This is an entire mounted skeleton of a bowhead whale. The whale itself was taken off Cooper Island in 1963 by Arnold Brower Sr. And when you think about it, that's, or if you do the subtraction, that's a 58-year delay between the taking of the specimen and it coming to be on display, a very impressive display at the museum here in Fairbanks. And I think it's instructive to realize again how long it takes to make teamwork really work and to synthesize understanding. One of the impressive things about that particular whale was it was taken off Cooper Island, which is shown here in this slide. And I'm reconstructing this hypothetically. I don't know the factual thing, but this is my reconstruction. The first 24 hours of those 58 years must have been taken towing the whale from its kill location off Cooper Island all the way around Point Barrow to near Narl, where it was butchered on the beach, and a gentleman by the name of Floyd Durham spent months cleaning up the skeleton and preparing it for use eventually on display. Okay, well, just quickly to finish, another example of the time it takes to mature understanding. Todd mentioned some of the, and Richard Glenn did too, some of the early going of PET 4 explorations. I think Ken Tape's book in 2010 makes extreme use of early PET 4 explorations that were not remembered well until Matthew Sturm helped recover some archived photographs. Here's a 1948 shot in Ken's book, and taken in the same place, I believe it was 2008, is a view of the growing shrubbiness found on parts of the Arctic slope and Noatak rivers in northwestern Alaska. That's an interval of 60 years gone by. And so in closing, I certainly wish the organizers of the 75th anniversary all cordial good luck in commemorating the 75th anniversary. And I hope they are forward thinking, but patient enough to derive understanding as well as knowledge from past experiences by the remarkable institution of UIC Narl. Thank you very much.